We're talking about this legacy. We've been in this series for a number of weeks now, and the concept is pretty simple. Jesus handed one of his disciples, John, a legacy. And then John handed it down to these other churches, and eventually it arrives in our laps as the letter of 1 John. This book that we read in the Bible, not the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that John, but at the very end, right before the book of Revelation, there's a 1 John. If you have your Bibles, open that up, paper, digital, doesn't matter. Grab that in your notes. The question I want to ask this morning is simply this. And by the way, as we're doing this, I think it's been interesting. I've asked some grandparents, hey, would you write me a legacy letter? Like if you were going to write a letter to your grandparents to your grandkids or to your kids, what would that letter contain? And I just invited them, hey, would you write this? And it's been interesting to listen to some of these grandparents say, it's hard to put into words in just one letter, how long? And some of them are short, some of them are really long. But can I tell you the one common thing that I hear in every single letter? I want you to know as my family that you're loved. I love you. I hear that every single legacy letter that I've read. And then they always say this too. And I hope that you'll love the people in your life as well. Receive love, give love. And so that's where we're at this morning. Where does love fit into the legacy that you're going to hand down to your family and friends? How important is the love legacy that you pass along? And here's why I think this is really important. John, when he's writing this letter, there's 5 chapters in there. And John didn't write 5 chapters because when he wrote the letter, it's just one long letter. There was no chapters or verses in the story. And so he just writes this letter. But we chopped it up into verses and chapters, and we have 5 chapters in there. And in 5 chapters, the word love shows up 40 times. 40 times. Something about John, he knew this, that love was really important to what Jesus handed him and what he was going to pass along. Now, you might think this. Maybe John's one of those kind of easy-loving guys. People loved him easily, and he just oozed love back on people. You ever meet those people? You greet them, and you put out your hand like that, to shake their hand. They're like, oh, no, I'm a hugger. Arr. You meet those people? Arr, those are men. Arr. If a woman goes, I'm a hugger, arr, it's weird. But you know those guys that just kind of hug you and they bear hug you and you're like, maybe that's John. Maybe John is the kind of guy that just loves people well. He's gregarious and just, if that's what you believe about John, can I just tell you this? You don't know John. Because that's not who he was. And I'm going to show it to you this morning. Before I do, though, I want you to get the concept of why love is so important. You're all leaving a legacy. I don't care if you're 22, 32, 82. You're building your legacy right now, and here's why love is so important. Could you imagine getting a letter from your grandfather or grandmother? Some of you never knew your grandparents. Pretend for a moment you did, though. You had 5 years with them, 10 years with them, 30 years with them, and they wrote you a letter, and they just said, I want you to know how much I love you. But what if they wrote it in a letter, but that was never your experience with them? What if they were harsh, intolerant, mean-spirited, negative people, and every interaction you had with them, it was not positive and loving, it was negative. And then you get this letter, this legacy letter that says, I just want you to know that you're loved. How valuable is that letter? It's not. I'm going to file it in the round file, known as the trash can. Because you can't write something that you've never actually lived out. You can't say, hey, I just want you to know that I love you, if that's not how we actually treat people. So for any of you, if you don't love naturally, if it's not the first expression that you have, or maybe with your family and your friends, you haven't left this legacy of love, listen, don't be discouraged this morning. John wasn't that kind of guy. He didn't love people well, didn't love them generously, didn't love them naturally. But something happened in John's life that changed him. And I want you to hear this. If you are breathing today, and hopefully you still are, If you're breathing today, it is never too late to change your legacy because love deeply matters. It might be the most important quality in a legacy that you pass on because that's a legacy that Jesus passed on to John and passes on to you. It's a legacy about love, 40 times in 5 chapters. Here's what I want to do this morning. I want to take a look at who John was. If you're looking at your notes there, I want to take a look at this. John was first of all this. He was a person of questionable character. Let me explain it this way. Jesus goes up on a mountainside to pray, and he's going to ask God, which of these followers that I have at this point do you want to be, my followers and my top 12 guys? And so he goes and he makes this prayer, and then he comes down and he picks these guys, and when he picks them, you actually get a list of their names. And I want you to hear this. By the way, go to the book of 1 John. Go find it in the back. It'll take you a while to get there if you've never read this before. I will eventually land there. But until then, I'm going to walk you through the book of Mark and a little bit in Luke. I want you to read how the other disciples described Jesus, or described John. Here it is. Jesus goes up on a mountain, says, I'm in Mark chapter 3, verse 14. Jesus appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. So the 12 that I'm about to name, these are going to be the men who are going to change the world, right? It says, these are the 12 he appointed. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. We know a lot about Peter. And then it says, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Now, John, this is the guy who wrote the Gospel of John, and then also writes the letter of 1 John. This is the John we've been talking about. And then it makes this statement. To them, Jesus gave the name, to them as to James and John, these two brothers, gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. John was half of this group, these two brothers known as the sons of thunder. So I was just really curious. If I Google imaged sons of thunder, what would I come up? This is not a Bible study right now, okay? I'm just saying, I was just curious. What kind of images come up when you come up with sons of thunder? This metal band, I mean, doesn't that kind of look like sons of thunder, or these good-looking guys over here? I mean, another metal band. I mean, these are the kind of people that come up. This next group, they're not a metal band, but they're actually a Christian group. But those two guys look like two guys I would look at and go, yeah, you're kind of the sons of thunder. They're not guys you're going to run up to and hug. And they're probably not going to come back and hug on you. Or this powerlifting weight team, look at those guys, sons of thunder. Or even better, maybe you missed this TV series, Chuck Norris did a series called The Sons of Thunder. They only made 5 shows before they canceled it. But when I think Sons of Thunder, I think Chuck Norris. When you think Chuck Norris, do you think love? I don't. Here's my point. I think James and John had earned that title from Jesus. There was something about their character, something about their personality. They had questionable character. Their personalities were questionable. They got that because of how rough they were. Now, if you think I'm making this up, let me take you on a little journey about who John was according to the scriptures. He was actually favored by Jesus. Peter, James, and John, oftentimes, they would get to go experience things that nobody else ever got to experience. There was this girl, she had died, and her dad ran to Jesus to say, my daughter's sick, and before he could get there, she died. Jesus is like, no, that's not the end of the story. So he goes in the house, and he's going to bring her back to life. And this is what it says in Mark chapter 5. He, Jesus, did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Peter, the brash, boisterous fisherman, and these two sons of thunder, they get to see these special moments where God displays his power over death. He was favored by Jesus. Why them? Was it because they had this amazing character and amazing integrity? I mean, Peter was a guy who was always stick his foot in the mouth and say dumb things, or he'd act first and think later. Jesus was always correcting him. We don't know why, but Jesus, he grabbed Peter, James, and John. They got to see more than all the other disciples ever got to see. So what were these guys like? Peter gives us a really odd snapshot of John. Now, you have to understand this. I'm reading a lot from the book of Mark, And it's believed that when Mark wrote his gospel, that he was taking all the things that Peter had said about Jesus and Peter had said about all these experiences with Jesus and these disciples. And so Mark is writing what Peter said. So we believe that in the book of Mark, what you have is Peter's account of who Jesus was and what he did. And so according to Peter, there's this moment that Jesus had predicted that he was going to die. Jesus said, you know what, I'm going to die. It was one of the first predictions he'd ever made about his death. But none of the disciples actually understood what was going on. And so it says they walked to this next town, Capernaum, and on the way they had an argument. Not Jesus. Jesus wasn't included in the argument. It was his 12 followers that were arguing about who was the greatest. Isn't that weird? Jesus is like, by the way, guys, I'm going to die. Let's go to Capernaum. And they're like, okay. By the way, Jesus, who's the greatest? It's just a weird view into kind of who these guys were. And then this happens. Teacher, said John. Okay, John says this. Teacher, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us. Think about this. On the way, hey, Jesus, I just caught this guy back there, and he was like doing miracles. He was like healing people in your name. But don't worry, I took care of him. I told him to knock it off. You know why? Because he's not in the club. He's not in the group. He ain't one of us. And so don't worry, Jesus, I took care of it for you. And Jesus replies, do not stop him, Jesus said. For no one who does a miracle in my name can in the next moment say anything bad about me. For whoever is not against us is for us. That's all that Mark says about it. And then they just go on. Like, what is the point of that story? Like, why would you write that unless it actually reveals something about who John was? Just if that's the only thing you knew about John from the Gospels, how would you describe him? Pick 3 words. I picked 3 words. Maybe they're accurate, maybe they're a little bit off, but here's my 3 words. Bossy, controlling, and alienating. Bossy, hey, don't do it. That's not the way Jesus did it. And so we're just, no, you can't do it. You're not one of us. Bossy, controlling. Oh, you know, I'm going to determine how it is that, the kingdom of God operates down here on earth. Alienating. Hey, you're not one of us. You stay on the outside. John's tendencies become even more clear in the next story. You know that between Jews and Samaritans, they didn't get along, right? There were like centuries of feuding going on back and forth. If you were a Jew, you didn't walk through Samaritan territory. You would always go around, even if it meant the journey was longer. Jesus didn't exactly do it that way, though. Jesus and his disciples, he is heading to Jerusalem. Jesus is a Jew. His followers are Jews, and they're heading to Jerusalem. And instead of going around the Samaritan territory, they go right through. This is how Luke records it. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. He knows he's going to go die, so he just picks, we're going to Jerusalem, and this is where it's going to happen. And it says this, and Jesus sent messengers on ahead, who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. They're like, find a hotel, find a place to stay, get that meal ready so that we'll all be ready to be welcomed and we'll spend the night. We'll go on from there. He sent messengers on ahead who went into the Samaritan village to get things ready for him, but the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. A group of Jews show up in this Samaritan village and like, no, you can't come in our town. We're enemies. What is John, this apostle who writes so much about love, how does he respond? Verse 54 reads this way. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them? I greatly admire their faith. Because think about it, why would they ask unless they're like, Jesus, you've given us some power and authority down here on earth. We've already done some amazing things for you. We've been with you for 3 years. We know what you are capable of. These guys, they were not nice. They were not friendly. They were not respectful. They disrespected Jesus. Jesus, why don't we call down fire from heaven? Let's just smoke them. You just give me the word, Jesus. We'll smoke them right now. Why would they say that unless they thought they could? I admire their faith. But what kind of man is John? In this sense, I would say this. He is mean, he is harsh, and at the very least, he is vengeful. That's who he was. And apparently, as this goes on, it's not just John, it's John and James. It wasn't like there was one son of thunder, there were two. And they were both just as bad. There's this final picture of John that I'm going to give to you that are from these early years. It's from the Gospel of Mark. Remember, this is Peter feeds Mark information. And in Mark 10, Jesus pulls aside his closest followers, the 12, right? And he speaks plainly to them about what's about to happen. Listen to what Jesus says to them. "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise." Jesus is not talking in code. He's being really upfront about it. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be delivered to who? To these Jewish authorities. Let me tell you what is about to happen to me. I'm going to be beaten, whipped, flogged. I will be killed. And then 3 days later, rise. Now, just imagine for a moment, you're one of the disciples, and Jesus just says that to you. You've been with him for 3 years. Now, the hard part is this. We kind of know the end of the story. We know Good Friday, we know Easter. We just kind of know what's coming. But if you didn't, and the man that you had just followed for 3 years is just letting you know that there is a beating, there is a whipping, there's a scourging, there's a death that is coming, and he's saying he is going to die, and you're one of the 12, how do you respond to that? Do you say, "Jesus, how do I help? Jesus, what should we do? Jesus, there's no way we're going to Jerusalem. There's no way that we're going to let this happen to you." This is how James and John respond. "Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we want you to do for us whatever we ask.'" Who are they thinking about? Themselves. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit on your right and the other on your left in your glory." Not, "Jesus, how can we help?" Not, "Jesus, that sounds really bad." Not, "Jesus, hey, we should do something different because we think that plan is terrible. We don't want you to go. Hey, Jesus, we love you." No. They're thinking this. Well, shoot, if you're going to die, then this is kind of our last opportunity to make sure that we get our places as number one, number two. James looks at John. He's like, "Hey, you can be the captain. I'll be the co-captain. If he's leaving, let's secure our spots now." Who does that? Apparently, the sons of thunder do. If you're going to pick 2 words based off of that story that describe him, what would you say? I just said selfish and impetuous. Selfish. They're thinking about themselves. They're not thinking about Jesus. They're not thinking about the group. Oh, what does that mean for us, the 12? How should we handle this? What is the right thing to do moving forward? Will we die too? They're just no, we want to be number one and we want to be number 2. Impetuous. They just can't help themselves but speak. Sometimes, have you ever thought something? You're like, "Oh, I'm thinking that." But then your mind actually starts thinking about what you're thinking about. You go, "I shouldn't say that," because it comes across as selfish. It not just comes across as selfish, it actually is selfish. And you would stop yourself. Impetuous, they just can't resist making the statement, and they go for it, and they just realize, I don't think they actually realize how selfish they are, but it gets worse. It says, when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Nothing builds team spirit like selfishness, right? Can we just say it this way? These guys are a piece of work. By the way, you know what's funny about the whole thing? The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know where all the stories are that paint John in a bad light? They're in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. None of them are in John. He refuses to throw himself under the bus. And so the fact that we know this about John at all is because the other disciples sold him out. We're like, no, you need to know who John is. I don't know if they smiled when this letter was written, but these guys, John in particular, bossy, controlling, alienating, mean, harsh, vengeful, selfish, impetuous. What happened to him? He writes a letter years later as an old man where love keeps coming up again and again and again. Was it a trash can letter? one where he hadn't lived that out for years. And when people read it, they're like, seriously, John wrote that? Whatever, there's no way John wrote that. Or if he did, it's worthless because he never loved anyone other than himself a day in his life. Is that what 1 John is? Can I tell you that John had a major turning point in his life? The first thing that happened was he was introduced to a brand new priority by Jesus. He was introduced to the priority of servant leadership. And let me tell you where it shows up. When James and John ask, hey, we want to be first and second, Jesus responds with these words. He says, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them. And what he's saying is, you think your position of power is to exercise authority over people. Maybe that's how it happens at your work and your place of business, that those in charge, they're just the authority and they're demanding. They don't care what you want or what you think. It's just their way or the highway. And Jesus says this, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man, he's referring to himself, even I did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. He introduces John to a brand new priority in life called servant leadership. For the first time in the history of the world, a servant leader, that concept is introduced. Before, leadership was all about power and authority. And Jesus says, you want to be number one, race to the back of the line. You want to be first, you want to be the most powerful, you want to be the person of greatest influence, then serve everybody else. Put their needs ahead of your own. It doesn't seem like a very good business principle, does it? But this is the brand new priority that Jesus introduces to John because he knew that James and he knew that John didn't get it right. He not just gives them a new priority, he gives them a new model. Remember, they're heading for Jerusalem. And after that teaching that Jesus gives them, you know, hey, this is the way it is. It's servant leadership. After that, John has this dinner with Jesus. They all gather together in what we know as the upper room. And Jesus is going to go to the cross the next day. Jesus knows he's going to die. His disciples haven't put it all together yet. And John, now don't miss this. John asked that question about, we want to be number one and number two. And Jesus gives him this teaching about servant leadership. And then Jesus goes to the cross. Now, don't miss this. John's there. He's actually within earshot of the cross. He can hear things that Jesus is saying on the cross. And years later, he's writing the Gospel of John, and he's remembering all of this. And he writes the letter of 1 John at the end of his life, and he's looking back on the dinner. That dinner that they had before the cross was, I think, John's greatest turning point. Listen to how he introduces it. Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, now he loved them to the very end. Jesus, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Jesus, knowing that he's going to go to the cross, he's about to suffer, he's passing on this legacy to these 11 men, Judas excluded. And these 11 men would change the world. He told them about servant leadership, but it wasn't enough to teach them. He now demonstrated it. In that culture, as well as ours, leaders are there to be served, right? I mean, the rabbi shows up, the teacher shows up, the leader of the group shows up, and everyone serves that leader. And Jesus is like, no, I already told you. It's about servant leadership, but I'm about to show you. And Jesus takes off his robe, and he grabs a towel. Remember, I'm reading this from John's gospel. The son of thunder. And I think his turning point wasn't just when Jesus told him, no, you need to be a servant leader. I think it's when he felt the water on his feet. Because he knew what he had stepped in that week. He knew what he had stepped in on the way to that dinner. Think about it, it's Passover in the city of Jerusalem. You know what you bring with Passover, right? Lots of animals to sacrifice. There's poop in the city. He knows where he's walked. He knows what he's stepped in, and Jesus pours water on his feet. And that's not enough. He washes and cleanses his feet, and he takes that towel and he dries them to make sure that his feet are clean. But I think what got more clean than his feet that night is his heart, because he experienced someone serving him. His leader, his rabbi, his master did the unthinkable. Cleaned the crap from between his toes. I know it doesn't sound very biblical, right? But that's what happens. And I think it's moments like that where John went, I experienced the thing that most people never will. I experienced how much Jesus loved me. I didn't know it then, but I know it now, that Jesus knew he was going to the cross and died. Even though he knew he was going to suffer and die, he cared about me that night. Can you imagine John thinking, and maybe even saying out loud, I've never loved anyone like that. But that's how Jesus loved him. And then Jesus made this statement. After he gets done washing everyone's feet, he says, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. John and these other disciples, they're given a brand new model called selflessness. And then they're given this command. Jesus, at that same dinner afterwards, says this, a new command I give you, love one another. Not just love one another, but listen to what he says. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. It's not just, hey, love one another, but it's, I want you to love people the way I loved you. What did Jesus know about John? He knew all the times he got it wrong. He knew all the times he was selfish, all the times he was harsh and mean and vengeful. He washed his feet anyways. And then he invited John to do the same thing. See, the legacy that Jesus handed John was a legacy of love. Love people. And then he turns around and just carry that legacy forward. That's why when John writes one of his final letters in 1 John, his legacy letter, that's why it's filled with love. Did you know this about John? He started out being called the son of thunder. Do you know what he was called at the end of his life? The beloved apostle. 2 reasons. When he writes about himself in his Gospel of John, he always describes himself as the one whom Jesus loved. And also, because of how much he writes about love in the Gospel of John and the book of 1 John. Can I just say this? I can say this accurately with an awful lot of confidence. John was a transformed man who was transformed by the love of Jesus Christ. It changed him from a son of thunder to the beloved apostle. So did it stick? Was John's legacy actually his transformation? I would just say this. John was changed because of a towel, not just a teaching. I think it was that moment with Jesus where he got his feet washed. And then right after that, when he was that close to the cross, where he realized Jesus did that for me, knowing he would go through that. Here's why we're doing this legacy letter. Jesus handed it to John. John hands it down to the church. Eventually, it ends up in our lap, right? If you're a follower of Christ, will your legacy resemble anything that Jesus handed down? Will our legacy actually resemble anything that John has handed to us in this letter? If our legacy will resemble theirs at all, just remember these words. Jesus said, I set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. That changed John. Changed his character. Changed how he loved people. I told you I'd eventually land in 1 John. I'm going to read to you what it is he wrote as his legacy letter. Here's what he writes. I'm in chapter 2, verse 7. He says, Dear friends, I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one. An old one, where did he get this command? From the dinner that night. which you've had since the beginning. The old command is the message you've heard, yet I'm writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him, in Jesus, and it's also seen in you. He's encouraging the church, like, I see this love in you. Because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. And then he makes 3 statements. They all start with anyone. Here's the first one. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. You're going to call yourself a Jesus follower? This is his words. You're going to call yourself a Jesus follower? You call yourself a person of Christ, or he wouldn't use this word, but we now would call the word Christian. You're going to call yourself a Christian. You can't call yourself that and hate your brother or sister in Christ. I don't mean your biological brother or sister. Maybe that's true. I mean any other believer. You can't hate them. Because if not, your legacy letter, trash. And then he makes this statement. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light. And the concept that Jesus is light, he's saying anyone who loves their brother or sister lives in this relationship with Jesus. There's nothing in them to make them stumble. Who stumble? Well, the person who's doing the loving and those who are receiving the love. Neither one of them should stumble. They should say, you know what? I recognize that love. It first came from Jesus. And then he finishes with this. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness, and they walk around in the darkness, meaning that you can't have this relationship with Christ and just carry hate in your heart. It doesn't work that way. If you claim to be a follower of Christ, I'm going to be careful here, and yet you hate, and your heart is filled with hate towards people, can I say this? You cannot just try to go out and try harder to love people. It doesn't work that way. You know what actually transformed John? It wasn't that he got to the end, he's like, oh, I received this teaching from Jesus, and I got a C on it, or a D on it, or an F on it. I really want an A. I should try harder. He felt the unbelievable love of Jesus when he washed his feet, and then he was there at the cross when Jesus dies on the cross, and he says, God, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. I mean, the same hands that washed his feet just the day before are now nailed to a cross. And John's the one who wrote, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. Listen, if you recognize that there's something in your heart that is not loving towards people, please don't just try it harder. It doesn't work that way. I guarantee you will fail. You know what you have to do? You have to go through an experience of understanding how much God loves you. You got to cuddle right up to the cross and figure out why Jesus did it and what actually happened there. You need an experience with him. Because oftentimes, if we're unable to love people, we have a way inflated opinion about who we are. My stuff don't stink. I know God loves me. He should. You don't know who you are. We need to come up to the cross and understand how much we've been forgiven. It makes loving and forgiving the other people in our life a whole lot easier. So John just says this, anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in this relationship with Christ, and there's nothing in them that makes them stumble. My final question is just this. Where will the towel and the teaching of Jesus show up in your legacy? If you wrote a legacy letter to your family and friends, would there be towel stories that they would tell about you? I mean, think about it for a moment. If you wrote to your friends and your family, hey, this is the final thing I want you to remember. Guaranteed there's going to be something about love in there. Hey, I want you to know that you're loved. Would they say, I remember when he did this? I mean, remember when she did this? And would they actually attach it to not just, hey, they loved me, but I know why they loved me, because they realized that they were loved by Christ. Can I just say this? We don't always love well. We'll get it wrong at times. But can I just say this? If you still have breath in your lungs, it is never too late to change your legacy. It's never too late to change your heart for people. You got to come really upfront with the cross about what God did for you. Him sacrificing his son on the cross. Jesus saying yes to that. It will change a person. Don't go try harder. But I would love it if you try to figure out how much he actually loves you. Because that'll change a woman. It'll change a man. Because John, when he started, he wasn't much like Jesus. But by the end, he was a whole lot like Jesus. Can you imagine a church that embraced this? If we said, you know what, if the distinguishing mark of what it means to be Jesus' followers was how we love one another, could you imagine if a whole church embraced that? It's been a hard week. Shootings. And I feel like it's every week now. Like there'll be a tragedy in the next 7 days before we gather together again somewhere. And because we have global pictures about what happens all over the world, we'll see some of it. Fires. I've been watching the Paradise situation somewhat carefully because 16 years ago, my wife and I were in Paradise, and we were walking the neighborhoods of Paradise asking the question, do we go here? Because we were either coming to San Jose or were we going to a church in Paradise? And I know that sounds weird, a church in Paradise. It's the name of a city in California. And so I knew the pastor there, Larry Shelton. I know he just retired this last year, and they just brought in a brand new pastor. Young pastor with young kids. He just moved to Paradise. He just started in August, and 3 months in, people are displaced everywhere. 90% of the town is burned down. I hope I have this accurate, but from what I could tell, they weren't sure if the church was standing. Church is people, right? The place where they would gather on Sunday. They weren't sure if it was actually standing or if it was burned down. And as far as I could tell, that church actually made it through the fire, and it's still standing. In Paradise, there's hardly anything standing in that town. So my heart's been drawn to that, and I asked God, what can we do? I found out there's a church in Chico, down the hill, called Neighborhood Church. The pastor from their church went down there and kind of set up base down there, and they just said, come, this church is welcoming us, doors wide open. I mean, food, shelter. They're gathering at Neighborhood Church in Chico today. Why? Because that's what God's people do. What if we were the kind of church that said when people are struggling and people are suffering or somebody's in trouble, that we love them with a towel kind of love, a practical kind of love, not a, hey, I love you. You saw the announcement we did last week and this week about, hey, we're going to have a team go up and rebuild homes up where they were burned in Santa Rosa. We filmed that before this fire ever erupted. It's just one of those that we go, what do we do, God? Can I give you a glimpse into this real quick, and I'm going to wrap this all up? I think what happens a lot in churches who, and I sense this, I know some of your stories, you love people. I know that you people are so generous. When there's a need, you're like, hey, we're in, just tell us, what do we do? But here's the problem that happens oftentimes in churches like ours that really want to help. We ask the question, okay, pastor, tell us what to do. We'll do whatever you want, just tell us what to do. And the problem is this, I don't always know what to do. I'll lead into something, but I just got the question, what if the Spirit of God actually lives in you? Not just the pastor. Now we're preaching. What if the Spirit of God actually lives in you? And he said, hey, I gave you family who live up there. You have friends who live up there. What if he's not inviting me to do something? He's inviting you to do something. And you come to me and say, hey, I know people who are up there. This is how we can help. We will rally a church around to create resources to support that. Because I think what happens sometimes is everyone looks to the pastor or the leaders of the church and say, you should determine what to do. Yes, but I think God has been working in you and through you that maybe he's given you the right thing that we can do. We can't serve everybody in Paradise, California. But I think there's people there that you might know that you'd say, hey, you know what? This is what they need right now. So let me just say this. We live in a world that will constantly have needs because we live in a broken world. We cannot solve all the brokenness around us. But when God lays it on your heart to do something about it, you can go do it by yourself, or you can gather people around you, or if there's a bigger need that you can't meet, then you call on your family, your church family, and you say, I don't know if this is from God or not, but this seems to be something that God has put in front of us, and maybe we rally around you. And because the need was brought to you, and we meet that need together, don't we want to be that kind of church? Where love is practical, tangible, and gritty. Listen, we ain't always going to get it right. And can I tell you this? I know some of you are sitting here and maybe you've had needs in your life and the church didn't rally around you. Maybe they never even knew, or that someone at church knew and they thought somebody else had it covered. Listen, we're not going to get it right, so forgive us. But dang it, we're going to try. If we haven't got it right in the past, let's get it right in the future. So can I just unleash you to not look at us to say, Pastor, what are we going to do? But maybe God has already said, hey, why don't you go do this? And if we can support you and resource you, you are the church. So go in the authority of Jesus Christ. Let's be that kind of church. Because I think those kind of churches, they change the landscape. And I think they'll change the landscape of the Silicon Valley. I don't think there'll be an empty seat in this church if we actually loved like that. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for how you love us. God, thank you so much that your love changed a hardened guy like John. If there's hope for him, there's hope for me. There's hope for me. God, there's hope for people sitting in these seats today. But God, I think some of us, we're just functioning at such a high speed of life right now, just trying to live and survive in this valley, that sometimes our eyes are so focused on us. Forgive us, God. We just need to trust that you're going to provide for our needs, and we're going to give our time, we're going to give our talents, we're going to give our resources away to people who have needs around us. But show us the right next steps about how to get involved in things like this. Because God, to be honest, we're overwhelmed at times at the needs around us. But instead of doing nothing, we can just do the right next thing that's in front of us. But we need to know what that is. So give us wisdom. Give us the right ears to hear what you're inviting us to do. And if you agree with that, would you say amen?